Hello friends, how are you doing today? My name's Mary and this is Happily Ever Esch. So today I'm doing a video that is like my audiobook wrap up. And in this video I want to talk not so much about my opinions on the actual books themselves, but more my opinions on the audiobook, what I thought about the narrator. Do I think if you're going to pick this book up, should you listen to it on audiobook essentially? So I read quite a few audiobooks. I think I'm sitting at like 22 books on Goodreads, and either half or one over half have been audiobooks. So I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and so I kind of want to share just my opinions on the actual audiobooks themselves, maybe encourage you to pick up some audiobooks if you haven't before. So yeah, I just want to share kind of this audiobook wrap up recommendation with you, and I'll probably do them about quarterly. I know it's April, so but in the next couple months, once I have accumulated more audiobooks, I'll do another video like that, and hopefully you'll get some recommendations. I know it can kind of be intimidating starting out in audiobooks. I was always super put off by them until I started listening to them, and now I'm obsessed, as you can tell. So I will say that all of the audiobooks that I've listened to, I have checked out from my Overdrive. That is an app, and I check out the audiobooks from my library, which is awesome because audiobooks can cost anywhere from, $10 to $20, just like a normal book can, which can add up, when you're reading lots of them. So I think libraries are a great resource to try out audiobooks for sure, if you're not sure if you're going to like them or not. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start from the first one that I read and go down. Obviously, I'm going to let you know if I liked the book or not, because that's going to affect my opinion. But I'm going to try to keep this as objective as I can based on like the production values and whether I like the narrator or not, and whether I thought the story translated well onto audiobook. So my personal opinions are going to flood in there, because if I didn't like a book, it's hard for a narrator or a production value to make up for that. So I will let you know what I thought of the book as well, but mostly trying to focus on what I thought of the narrator and the production value and the book as an audiobook. The first audiobook that I finished this year was Behind the Beautiful Forever's Life, Death, and Hope in a Mumbai Undercity. This is by Catherine Bu. This is a story written by Catherine Bu, who is a journalist, about a slum in India called Anawadi. This is a slum right behind a huge international airport, and this is really just kind of like a case study of these people's lives. Really writes a narrative story of the people living in this city called Anawadi. It was a very hard read. It was very heartbreaking at times, but there were just so many glimpses of hope in this story. I learned a lot about the social, economic, and political effects in Mumbai from this book, even though it really is kind of looking at these people's lives. She ties a lot of those things into her writing, so you can kind of understand how they are affecting the people that she's writing about in Anawadi. This is narrated by Sunil Malhotra. I'm so sorry if I'm not saying that correctly. But he did an absolutely fantastic job at narrating. He does all the different voices of the people who are talking, and there are lots of different people in and out of the story. There are some story threads that we follow, but Catherine Bu really wrote about a widespread of people, so it did get at times confusing to listen to because there are just so many people, but I thought Sunil did a wonderful job of making the voices distinct, making you really feel like people were talking when there was dialogue or conversation. I thought his narration was absolutely wonderful. It definitely heightened my reading experience, and I think that if you are wanting to pick this book up, picking it up on audiobook would only enhance your experience. And also, Catherine Bu reads her acknowledgments at the end, which I thought was great. I always love hearing from the authors, so that was an awesome audiobook. The next book that I listened to is Moonwalking with Einstein, The Art and Science of Remembering Everything by Joshua Foer. This was narrated by Mike Chamberlain. This is a nonfiction read, again, about memory. and Joshua Foer's kind of exploration into memory competition. I thought Mike Chamberlain was an excellent narrator. I thought this book was wonderful to listen to. I definitely think listening to it kept me more intrigued than I would have if I had just been reading it. I think that the way Joshua Foer wrote this book made it translate so well to listen to, because he's flooding in his story with all of these scientific facts and case studies and psychology, and so it just bodes so well to listening to it, because you're getting a narrative story as well as these facts. And I just felt like I was listening to such an interesting lecture. I wanted to keep listening to it. I thought Mike Chamberlain did a great job. He has a nice voice to listen to, and I definitely recommend listening to this on audiobook as well. Next, we have Blackbird House by Alice Hoffman. This is narrated by a whole bunch of narrators. Each chapter is narrated by a different person, so I was lazy and I did not look who each of those people were. This is kind of a tale of interconnected short stories centering around Blackbird House. If you're interested in picking this up, I would not recommend listening to it on audiobook. Personally, I thought that the change in narrators was super jarring, and I thought that it lessened my enjoyment of the novel, because I would really enjoy one narrator and then the next story would be a different narrator, and I might not enjoy them so well. So I had a hard time judging whether I was enjoying the piece of work, because I was just so focused on that I liked this narrator better than that. I did like, because it was a short story collection type thing where there was different characters we were following in each chapter, I did appreciate the change in narrators, but I don't think I would have had as many. And I definitely think I would have enjoyed this book more had I read it physically. So I think if you're interested, I would pick up the physical copy. And I think that I'm going to pick the physical copy up as well. So it's definitely not one that I dislike, because I really liked the story and I ended up giving it a high rating anyway. But I think that this story and the way that this production is done would just be better to read it physically. Next, we have Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End by Dr. Atul Gawande. This was narrated by Robert Petkov. Being Mortal is Dr. Atul Gawande's kind of reckoning with death, how we treat death, and in particular looking at like the over-medicalization of the process of dying, and kind of how his comments on how he thinks that our society could make it better for people who are dying. I absolutely loved listening to this on audiobook. I thought that Robert Petkov did a phenomenal job narrating it. He had a very nice voice. He made the story just flow. I thought that the text translated very well to listening to it on audiobook. Again, we kind of have these narrative stories flooding through it, but also the kind of facts and figures. And so I think that that type of nonfiction translates very well to being listened to, because you're having a narrative and a story to keep you intrigued, and then they're kind of throwing the facts and the figures at you, and it doesn't seem overwhelming. It seems very natural to listen to it because you have the storyline going through it. I would absolutely recommend listening to this on audiobook, but if not, pick it up anyway, read the book, because this was phenomenal. But I thought the audiobook was very well done. Next, we have Silver Sparrow by Tiari Jones. This is a family drama-esque story following two sisters, and they have the same father but different mother. Dana is one sister. Her mother and her are the hidden family. So he is married to Dana's mom, but they are the secret family. No one knows about them in James' life. And then we have Charisse and her mom, who are the family that is the public family, who everyone knows that James is married to, and so it's these two sisters' story. The first half of the book is narrated by Rosalind Coleman Williams. The second half is narrated by Heather Alicia Sims. That is because the book is split as Dana telling the first part of the story and Charisse telling the latter part of the story, and then I believe that Dana comes back in and does the epilogue, and that was also narrated again by Rosalind Coleman Williams. This was an excellent audiobook. Both of those narrators added so much life and character to the story. I loved having the two voices for the sisters. Unlike Blackbird House, it worked so well here because it was just two narrators. in my mind, they had an equal strength in storytelling. They made those characters come alive to me. I loved listening to them narrate the story. They embodied the characters so well with their voice. This was a thrilling audiobook. Definitely will keep you on the edge of your seat, and just a wonderful story to listen to. I would highly recommend picking this up. Again, rather if you pick it up physically or through audiobook, but would highly recommend the audiobook and would say this would be a great place to start with audiobooks, just because the story is so intriguing and super not an intimidating one to pick up. It is just an intriguing, beautiful story with two phenomenal narrators. Next, I listened to The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business. This is also narrated by Mike Chamberlain. He narrated Moonwalking with Einstein, which is kind of funny because these books are very similar in theme and the topics that they deal with. So The Power of Habit is just that, how habits work in our lives, how they work in our brains, and what we can do to kind of gain more control over our habits and change them so they can better have a more positive effect in our life. This kind of does the thing of nonfiction where it tells you what habits are, how they work in our brain, and then goes and gives you all these different case studies. Mike Chamberlain did a wonderful job narrating this, but I don't think that this type of story translates as well to the audiobook as the Moonwalking with Einstein did, because it is these different chunks, these different case studies, and you're kind of getting all of the science knowledge at the beginning and kind of having to listen through that and then getting these different stories. I didn't feel like it was as intriguing and as smooth of a listen as Moonwalking with Einstein was, and I was constantly comparing them because both of these works use the same case studies and they use the same narrator and they were dealing with a lot of similar themes, so I couldn't help but compare it to Moonwalking with Einstein. So I wouldn't say don't pick this up on audiobook. I would say though, if you're gonna choose, I would choose Moonwalking with Einstein because you're getting a lot of the same information. Next, I listened to Telling the Bees. This is by Peggy Hesketh and it was narrated by Norman Dietz. I should start out by saying that this was not my favorite story. It follows a gentleman who has lived in the same house his whole life. He's a beekeeper, and it follows his story. It's very literary, semi-mystery. I don't think that this story translates well to audiobook at all. The story is very slow. Every start of the chapter starts off by talking about bees and different things that bees do and different scientific things about bees, which was totally over my head when listening to it on the audiobook. They were interesting facts, but just things that I couldn't absorb just by listening to it without really reading it and thinking through it. The narrator, while I understood why they chose him, because the story is about an older gentleman who has lived a quiet life, made it even more boring. And so I think that I would not have disliked this book so much had I picked it up. I probably wouldn't have finished it had I picked it up physically, but I did not think that this was a good audiobook. I don't think that if you're starting with audiobooks, you should start here, because I think that you would be bored to tears. And yeah, I know that sounds really, really harsh, but I wish I wouldn't have picked this up on audiobook. I wouldn't recommend this one. If you're interested in the story, I would say pick up the physical copy. I think you could appreciate the writing more that way than listening to it. Next, I listened to The Grownup by Gillian Flynn. This was narrated by Julie Whelan, and it was great. Julie Whelan did a wonderful job narrating this. I believe that she narrates Gone Girl too, and I don't know if she does all the other stories, but I loved her narrating Gillian Flynn's novels and her kind of very interesting female characters. I just think Julia Whelan has the perfect narrating voice for Gillian Flynn's characters. They did a wonderful job casting her. I don't think I would have liked this book had I read it, but I loved listening to it on audiobook. I guess love is probably a strong word. I liked this book a lot listening to it on audiobook. It was super fun. It was super fast. It was very intriguing to listen to it. I think I got more of the suspense because I was listening to it and I felt you can't kind of look ahead and see what's going to happen, you know, even if it's a few sentences. I think listening to this type of thriller, psychological thriller, is an awesome experience. So yeah, I would definitely recommend listening to this. And if Julia Whelan does the rest of Gillian Flynn's audiobooks, I would recommend picking those up as well because she did a phenomenal job. Next, I listened to Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is Ta-Nehisi Coates' story about being a Black man in America, his experiences, and he's writing to his son through these essays, and Ta-Nehisi Coates does narrate it. I did enjoy listening to this, but I would say if you're wanting to pick this up, I would pick it up first and read it physically and then listen to the audiobook. I think listening to the audiobook was a great experience. I loved hearing Ta-Nehisi Coates read his stories, but I have heard Jasmine over at Novel Thoughts, hey girl, new to her channel, she's absolutely amazing, so I mean, I'm sure you've heard of her, but if not, go check her out. She's a gem. But she does a bookish talk about Between the World and Me and says that she kind of feels like his writing can be stream of conscious, and I definitely agree, and I think that's cool to listen to hear him just say the beautiful words that he crafts, because he does craft some beautiful words. But I think if you're really wanting to absorb what he's saying, because he's saying so many important things, that reading it physically and being able to think about it and then listening to him narrate his audiobook, that is totally the way to go. Next, I listened to Redeployment by Phil Clay. This is a collection of short stories all about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It was narrated by Clegg Klein. I definitely enjoyed this audiobook. I had originally picked it up and was listening to it, and then I went and I got it from the library because I thought, well, maybe I would enjoy reading it physically more, and then missed the narrator and went back to listening to it on audiobook. I will say why I went and picked it up from the library was because in a lot of the stories they use a lot of military acronyms, and that got extremely confusing to listen to, like the OIF and the, you know, whatever other acronyms they said. That could be very confusing. So maybe this is an audiobook that you want to buy or have the physical copy and listen to it, and so you can look at the physical copy, which is what I did when I was confused. I would go home and like read the story or read along while I was listening. I think that this type of book really translates well to listening to it and having it physically to read, or at least go back to if you're a little confused with all of the military slang and acronyms, because as a civilian that was confusing to me. I will say at the very end, on the last story, for like the last 2 minutes of it, they played this military song, and in my mind it made absolutely no sense, because in the story they're talking about silence. So they're playing this military music while the character is making this point that is very important to the story about silence. And I just was like, who made this choice? Because that's not what I would have done. So that kind of annoyed me, and it left a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth at the end, because I was like, what are you doing? And I was just utterly distracted by listening to the music. So that might not bother you, but something of the production value that I just thought, I don't think I would have made this choice. I just finished Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. This is narrated by the author J.D. Vance. This is his memoir of being a self-proclaimed hillbilly and the culture of the hillbillies that he's saying is in crisis, and kind of trying to tell his story and make his point of why he thinks that is. I really enjoyed listening to this. This was an easy listen. Great to listen to J.D. Vance tell his story. I wanted to keep listening to it. It just flowed. And so if you're going to read this, I absolutely would suggest that you pick this up on audiobook. It's the author telling his story, which was absolutely great. I think a lot of people would say that, like, when people do pick up audiobooks, I think they pick up memoirs, because a lot of times the author narrates it, and this was no exception. A great memoir to listen to, because the author's experiences and telling his story, just it adds a whole another level of enjoyment to the book. So that was my probably not so quick audiobook wrap up. I hope that this is helpful or enjoyable for people. It's good for me to go back and look at the narrators and see kind of who I liked, who I didn't, why I liked what I liked, and why I didn't like what I didn't like. So I hope it was somewhat helpful. Please feel free to recommend any audiobooks that you love. I'm always looking for new audiobooks to listen to. They have just brought so much joy to my reading. I'm very thankful for them. And so I hope, again, that this was helpful, and I hope that you all are well, and I hope to talk to you soon. Bye.